essentially cereal pollen, right? That's to say like grain that we all eat, right? Today, if you went to Iowa and you cored Iowa, you'd probably just find corn, stuck at the top, for example. But you're looking for grain because if you find lots of grain, what that tells you is there's more agricultural use. If you have more agricultural use, you have more people working the land, hence a good proxy for demography, right? That's to say population. So if you have more grain samples, you have more people. And so what people have done when it came to the Black Death, again, that's the 14th century outbreak of the plague, is they found that there's a drastic change in land use in the 1350s, 1360s, right? So there's less agricultural production, right? So if you're expecting half the population dies, it wouldn't surprise us that we have fewer people working the land. So we said, great, let's see if we can find that in the Justinianic examples that we have. And again, this is a rather complicated graph, but again, this is the middle line here, the dotted line is the outbreak of plague in 542, and we've pulled these pollen cores from across, as you can see, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, which is the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, right around Constantinople, that's struck by the plague. And the point to take away from this graph is, again, we can go into the details if you're curious, but the slopes remain the same before and after. Right? That is to say, the places that were increasing their agricultural production, right? So you can see some of these here, just continue to increase their agricultural production, and the places that were decreasing their agricultural production just continued on as before. So there doesn't seem to be any break whatsoever or changes in land use that we could identify with the Justinianic plague. So what I want to turn to now are some of our more recent work, which is looking at short and mid and long-term effects of plague, right? To really tease out what's happening at an annual, at a decadal, and maybe at a 50, 60-year range. So the first thing are short-term responses. Much of the initial response seems what we might call irrational, right? So you have examples of monks and clerics were beaten to death in the streets because they were thought to be bringing the plague. Right? Obviously, without the idea of how germ theory and germs work, they didn't know what was killing them. But this was an extremely irrational, quote unquote, behavior, even for them at the time. You also had examples where people were throwing pitchers and various things into the streets to basically scare away death. Now, the thing is this looks, quote unquote, irrational to us now, but actually it's just as irrational as many of our responses, I think, to COVID over the last year. As the sock puppet has probably all distracted you in the middle, so I'll start with that first. But during the early days of COVID, as I like to call it, the long march of 2020, people were doing hilarious things like this and sticking them on Twitter and getting huge numbers of followings and likes because everyone was just sitting in their house designing ways to, I guess, pretend to eat cars. Likewise, Lee is very proud he designed this meme, so we can give you the link to it if you really want to use it, about all of us wiping down groceries with Clorox, right? Now, maybe not all of you do this, but I certainly did this. I took my groceries and quickly transferred them into a giant cooler that we bought sitting on our back porch and left things there with ice packs for 2 days. I mean, it's completely irrational in retrospect and makes no sense whatsoever. But again, when you're in the immediate throes of an epidemic and a pandemic, you kind of react in completely irrational ways. So what I'm trying to say here is people in the past were no more or less rational than we are today. The second thing that's interesting were what we might call rational responses. These were locking yourselves in your home. So we have examples of this during the Justinianic Plague. And we also have farmers who refused to supply food to various cities. They didn't want to go into the city. Now, again, these look rational to us today, right? Locking yourself in your home. But as Lee described how the plague works and it transfers through rodents and fleas, locking yourself in your home wouldn't do anything, right? Let's say it's a rat that carries this or it's a rodent that carries this. Those things just enter the homes anyway. So that didn't do anything. It was no more or less rational of response is what I'm trying to say here. Now, the state response was actually quite, for what they could do at the time, resilient, to use that overused term. The first thing they had to deal with were burial problems in Constantinople, right? So the number of deaths did increase significantly, even if we don't want to say 10,000 people died a day. We know from various pandemics, such as COVID or the 1918 influenza pandemic, once you reach a very small percentage over your quote unquote normal number of deaths, the way to handle burials actually becomes very complex very quickly. And what actually happens here is, if you can see on the box on the right-hand side, but which I won't go through in too much detail, is that you have responses that are fairly precise, fairly orderly, and fairly rational. So first you appoint a special official to take care of the dead, and then you try to use the graves you have. You create ways of transporting the extra bodies. You dig larger graves. You try things like you ship them out to sea and you throw them in the sea, which not surprisingly didn't work. And then you eventually dig larger mass graves. And what's interesting in Constantinople at the time is this was done in a very orderly way. They paid people on the spot extremely well. And they also had support from the various different factions of the city supporting what they did. So in that sense, with a short-term immediate response, it was actually fairly good. Now, looking a little more long-term, we can look at, say, what were the changes to the economy long-term. And the issue here is there really aren't any macroeconomic changes we find, right? We find one law that has to do with labor relations in terms of, what we would now call, say, blue collar versus, the 1% and how relationships and how they should be paid. But there's no indication of the state changing laws completely. There's no tax exemptions and reliefs in the law, and no petitions for tax relief anywhere as far as we've ever been able to find, right? And this compares, say, to a war that's happening at the same time in the middle of Italy, where you have tax reliefs that are constantly happening, and they're actually quite common. We get none of that. We get no government relief of funds at all. In fact, the only real evidence we have is a slowdown in the war that's happening with Persia, which is what's now Iran and Iraq today. And that drops off a bit for a year or two before it picks back up. A couple more things. Then you also have grain shipments. The city of Constantinople was extremely large, so it had to be supplied from Egypt from grain. And this had been going on for centuries. And what you can find in the data here is that, in fact, right in the year or so after the plague, the amount of grain that's shipped is reduced, right? Now, whether this has to do with a smaller population or a smaller workforce is kind of unclear. But you do have a reduction in the grain supply. But within about 3 years, that reaches the level it was before the plague. And within about 5 years, it's actually more than it was, right? So we have more trade, more grain reaching the city of Constantinople very quickly. The last piece of economic evidence that we do have for the short term, we might say, is from coinage. And this is from a monetary reform that's undertaken right during the middle of the plague. Now, the coins of the Emperor Justinian, who starts his reign in 527, look like this. These are called pre-reform coins. As you can probably notice, it's the kind of stick figure ugly dude facing to the right on the screen here. And then what happens over time, or in about 538, 539, is the coins get much larger, the coins get much heavier, and there's more of them. And then in about 542, 543, right when the plague breaks out, they actually start to get smaller, but they don't go back to the original size, right? They're not as small as these, they're kind of just like in between. And this seems to suggest something is happening when it comes to plague, that perhaps there's a stress on minting capabilities and the ability to state supply coinage. But again, we don't have any documents telling us about this. And it might also be, if you look at the N, i.e. the numbers, there's far fewer of these coins. So in fact, the state simply just had enough coins to circle around. So we're not quite sure, but this is something we're working on with our colleague Alan Stahl to try to figure out what exactly is happening here. And the last point is to talk about long-term changes. Now, as Lee said, outbreaks were different everywhere, right? Constantinople was certainly the worst because it's the biggest city, and also probably because of various ecological and environmental particularities to the city that we just don't know, and probably, to be honest, never will know. Now, other places probably had a smaller impact. Some of them were probably worse. We just don't know in many of these cases. The other thing to keep in mind is it's really hard to tie long-term, say 50, 60-year changes directly to plague. And I'll just give you my favorite example, as Lee is tired of hearing about, from probably my favorite city to spend time in Europe if I ever get back, is the city of Arles, which is in southern France. And it's delightful to go there. I highly recommend it. But what we know in Arles is that the city of Arles, on political, economic, and cultural terms, right? That is to say, as a political center, as an economic hub, and as a cultural center of production and religion, begins to decline in about the year 500. That's about 40 years before the plague breaks out. And we know this continues on throughout the entire 6th century. Now, plague may have accelerated this change. It's certainly plausible, but we just don't know, right? I mean, the city itself was not doing very well for a whole bunch of reasons that if you're really curious about, I'd love to talk about. But plague may have exacerbated this situation. And this is certainly a possible explanation. But again, you can't actually link causal change to any of this. So with that, I will pass it back to Lee to talk about some of the modern ways in which this is done.
So is this clear now? Yes? Okay. Okay, so thanks, Merle, and I'll continue from here. Okay, so given all the evidence Merle showed us, why do we then assume plague was such a big deal? To put it simply, and we have weak evidence for plague, we have weak evidence for its effects, but nonetheless, scholarship over the past few decades has continued to attribute to plague the large-scale impacts, again, such as the fall of the Roman Empire. Moreover, non-academic media is, I mean, this fall of the Roman Empire is very attractive to non-academic media as well, especially when they discuss the Justinianic Plague. You can see an example here on the slide. This is from a video I found on YouTube. This video was uploaded a month and a half ago and already has 220,000 views. So it's a pretty popular video. It connects, see here on the right side, connects the Justinianic Plague, which it calls the Plague of Justinian, to the fall of Rome through the Black Death connection, implying that the Justinianic Plague and the Black Death are kind of the same, and they caused the fall of Rome. So why? Why is this so popular? Why do we keep making so much out of plague, out of so little evidence?